Front Page News, Finding Archived Newspapers. Hi, my name is Drew Smith, and this is part 2 of the two-part series. In part 1, I showed you all the different kinds of newspaper articles that might mention your ancestors. So the question now is, how do I find them? So let's talk about that. Let's begin with a timeline, and we're going to be focusing in this part primarily on U.S. newspapers or American newspapers. The reality is that the earliest American newspaper was published in 1690, but the daily newspapers didn't start appearing until 1784. Now, as we go through time, and this is going to change year to year, newspapers in the United States may be in the public domain. So it could be from 1924, but if you're watching this in the next year, it could be 1925 and so on. So that means that there is no copyright in effect for those newspapers. Anyone can take that content from the newspapers and put it online or do anything else they want with it. Once we get into the 1970s and the era of computer systems, we start to see newspapers being born digital. That means that the reporters and the other individuals that worked for the newspapers that were entering the information were now, instead of using typewriters or some other kind of equipment, were using computer systems to enter the information. And this became more and more prevalent as we got into the 1980s and the 1990s. Then even smaller newspapers could afford to use computer technology. So if we're going to see information that was published earlier than when newspapers were born digital, that means that that information has to be scanned and converted into text. This is called optical character recognition, or OCR. And so usually it's done from microfilm, but it could be actually from the paper. And what that does is it attempts to transform that into digital text. This is not a perfect process. Newspapers were never intended really because of the kinds of paper they were on. They were considered to be temporary things, not permanent like what you might find in a good quality paper in a book. And so as a result, we're going to see errors in optical character recognition. It's getting better as time goes by, but it's not perfect. Now, if you're trying to find what newspapers to look at for your ancestor, a good place is to go to Chronicling America and look for the Search U.S. Newspaper Directory. This covers all those newspapers that are known to have been published at some time in the United States or in the colonial times, and it can help you find newspapers that might have been published in a particular U.S. state, in a particular county in that state, or even in particular cities in those counties. You can even enter the time frame. So if you know where your ancestors lived and when they lived there, you can use a form like this on the Chronicling America site to search to find out what are the names of all the newspapers that might contain information about your ancestor. Here's where I did that for my own ancestors in Newberry, South Carolina. And so I was able to discover that there was one newspaper out of, actually, there were 39 published in Newberry at different times. Many of these were published only maybe a year or for very short periods. Others changed their names. So in fact, even if you don't see the newspaper continuing on, it may be because that newspaper took on a new name. Sometimes newspapers also merged. And so that could cause the end of one particular title and a new title. But you can see that there are quite a few newspapers here. I'm interested in particular in the Newberry Herald and News. I see that that was published between 1884 and 1903. And that's a really good period, again, because we have that gap in the census records between 1880 and 1900. And so I'm really eager to find any coverage of my family that may have been living in Newberry during that time period. I can learn a bit more by clicking on the link to find out about the Newberry Herald and News, what it covered, who the publisher was, how often it came out, semi-weekly, that it was a Newberry County newspaper. I can also discover what the titles were before 1884. In fact, the Herald and News was two separate newspapers, one called the Newberry Herald, published as early as 1865, and another called the Newberry News, published in 1878. So those two were merged together in 1884, and then in 1903, for whatever reason, the decision was made to drop the name Newberry from the title of the newspaper. It was simply called the Herald and News, even though it was still being published in Newberry, and it did that from 1903 to 1937. Here's an example of an image from the Newberry Herald and News from August 28, 1884. It talks about what was going on in the community at that time. Very useful information. So things like who owned the business, who were the editors of the newspaper, and what were the things that were going on in Newberry, such as the rise of sharecropping, or the building of the railroads, or the emergence of the cotton industry. All of these things were really critical to the business and functioning of the town of Newberry, South Carolina. And here's where we can see where the newspaper is, because that's really our next question is, I want to see copies of the Newberry Herald and News. Where can I look for them? Well, as it turns out, there are copies on microfilm of many copies held at the South Carolina Museum in Columbia, South Carolina. But then there's also copies held at the University of South Carolina in Columbia, South Carolina. So both of those are institutions that if I had a particular date that I might want to be searching on, I might be able to contact one of those two institutions with the information and say, could someone look at the newspaper from that date and possibly even scan a page or an image to send to me so I could see what it says. One of the things you may want to know about is the U.S. newspaper program. So this was something that went on for quite some time, 1982 to 2011, and this was done by the NEH and the National Endowment for the Humanities. So the money was used for all 50 states to take and collect the newspapers, microfilm them, preserve them in every U.S. state. So that was the idea, that there were all these state projects. Those projects were successfully completed. Most of the institutions that were in charge of this, many were university libraries. As you saw in the previous slide, it was University of South Carolina. It was available there to do it for the state of South Carolina. In Florida, where I live, the University of Florida in Gainesville is the university libraries that is the headquarters for all of the Florida newspapers, keeping copies of as many of those as possible. In some states, it's not the university library, it's the state library or the state archive. So you're going to find usually one of the two, either the university libraries or the state libraries or archives. In a few states, it might be a public library, such as in New York. The New York Public Library may be responsible. And also in a very few states, it might even be a state historical society that is received the grant and was able to do that. Now, once 2011 was done, they no longer digitized microfilm, or that wasn't the plan. The plan was actually to digitize the newspapers either directly or digitize the microfilm, but they were no longer microfilming at this point. They were simply trying to take the newspapers that were originally in the United States newspaper program and put them through something called the National Digital Newspaper Program and to put that information online. So that's one of the leading institutions, leading programs in the United States to make U.S. newspapers available to all of us. And what we see here is a product of both the National Endowment for the Humanities, NEH, and Chronicling America, which is part of the Library of Congress, to actually take these newspapers, digitize them, and make them available for us. And so you can go to Chronicling America to do these searches. You can pick a particular state, you can pick a particular newspaper, you can do a search across many states or many newspapers, that's up to you, and you can fill out the form on the advanced search. I always suggest going to the advanced search so you have all the options here, and you see that that gives you options to put in multiple words, even put in phrases such as someone's name to see what we might find. Here's an example where I did a search on the name Boddy, B-O-D-D-I-E, and I'm actually looking at results in Edgefield, South Carolina, the Edgefield Advertiser, which was the newspaper published there over a period of time. And so I'm looking for any references to that surname. Those are going to be interesting to me. So I can see the the images of the pages. I see I have 105 hits, which is very relevant, and I can start going through those and seeing what they actually have to say. And here is the page a little bit zoomed in on, and by the way, you do have the ability to zoom in and zoom out to look at these pages, to move them around and search. You can also look at a PDF of this, so that if you wanted to save it as a PDF or a JPEG, you can do those things too. You can also move through the different images that have come up. You can move through the pages that are being looked at here. So you have lots of ability to kind of move around here. In this particular case, I've discovered a reference which I had talked about in part 1, Mr. J.R. Body, who was running for the office of magistrate. And this found that particular record of him and highlighted his name so I could see it much more clearly in the original article. If I need a citation, this is the wonderful thing about Chronicling America, you can actually take that citation on the page, copy it, and paste it into your genealogy software. The other nice thing about it is that every image that you see has its own direct link. That's a permanent link. So you can click on that link and it'll take you to that image of that particular page of that newspaper. Very useful. Now, another site that you can find digitized newspapers is Google News. Google once got into the business very heavily. They seem to have cut back a bit, but they still have kept the Google News newspaper archive out there, so some of those papers are still there. And you will find some papers that you won't find in Chronicling America. Sometimes it's because they're after the copyright date, and sometimes it's just ones that Chronicling America didn't get to. So I was curious about the paper that I grew up with in Newberry, the Newberry Observer, and I wanted to see if maybe I could find a newspaper that mentioned my parents' wedding. And so I clicked in to look for the Newberry Observer, and I see that they do have some from the 1930s, the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s. And in the 1940s, they have a few issues. As it turns out, they did not have the issue in 1943 of my parents' wedding. So I basically still had to go look at microfilm in a local public library some years ago to get that story. But there are other interesting things you can find as you're paging through some of these more current stories. And here's an example. Right after the beginning of 1940, they had a first baby contest. The who won that, what was the individual who was the first baby born in 1940. And so they did give some awards and some credentials to that person. And so that was one of the things. You'll notice that it's highlighting the headline, First Baby Contest. And there's also a link. So this is, again, one of those direct links that you could copy, you could put into an email to someone, you could put into your genealogy software, and this would allow you to return to this article anytime you wanted to. Another website that has newspapers primarily from New York State, a few around New York State, but the bulk are from New York State, is Fulton History. And Fulton History has been doing this for a number of years. It's really pretty much the work of one person. And their interface can be a little tricky to deal with. So one of the things you might do instead is to use Google to search the Fulton History website. You can actually go into Google, do site:/fultonhistory.com, and then put whatever search terms you're interested in, such as Body, if that's a surname you're interested in, or whatever name you're looking for. And then you can get those results and click through to actually read the articles. You can see that they do cover times that might even still be under copyright. Elefind is an interesting website. It's got a lot of materials from Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, but it also has some things from the United States. And so you will see things like Brooklyn Public Library or the Cambridge Public Library and a few others. So this is yet another place that if you're not finding what you're looking for in Chronicling America or in Google, you might visit Elefind and see if perhaps you can search it there. Just to show you though how useful it is for Australia, they have quite a few Australian titles, over 4,200 at the time that I took this screenshot, and that's been a little bit of time. So you can see that they've got quite a few newspapers. Depending on the newspaper, maybe only a few. For some other newspapers, maybe over 11,000 and quite a few items. So it just is going to depend a lot on which newspaper you're looking at. Genealogy Bank is a popular subscription site for genealogists and is searchable. It's got a lot of small town newspapers, so you can do a search if you have a subscription. You can find what you're looking for, and you can also look to see what particular newspapers it might have and what time frames are covered. Very useful, particularly before you decide to subscribe. ProQuest gives you some of the major city newspapers, and often you may not be subscribing to ProQuest yourself. You may be getting access to it through your local public library or through a local academic library. That would be an example, might be the New York Times, ProQuest has every issue of the New York Times, and so if you want to see if your ancestor was mentioned there, you might have to find a library that has a subscription through ProQuest of the New York Times. When you do that, you can actually narrow it down by type of article, and you have a lot of search results that you can narrow and filter. Perhaps one of the biggest newspapers subscription sites is the one run by Ancestry, which is newspapers.com, and it comes in two different flavors. There's just newspapers.com, which tends to be the older newspapers, the ones that are in the public domain, but they also have a higher level subscription called Newspapers Publisher Extra. What you're paying for extra is licensing of some newspapers that are still under copyright, so that Ancestry can share the proceeds from that extra money with the newspapers that have been made available. So if you really are needing to see some of the more recent newspapers from, let's say, the late 20s, the 1930s and after, you may have to go with Publisher Extra in order to see those particular newspapers. Here's where I'm looking for the surname Body in South Carolina in the 1800s up to 1880, and I can see that, yeah, there are quite a few references, 826 in South Carolina, and I can narrow it by drawing those particular date ranges together. I can browse through some of these things. I can add additional search terms if I decide I want to, but I'll probably find a lot of stuff about my ancestors in these newspapers. MyHeritage also has a number of newspapers. Now, what they also do is they have access to the Chronicling America site. They also take individual pages and break them out by states. And so if you just want to search Pennsylvania newspapers or Florida newspapers or Ohio or Massachusetts, whatever, you can do that. Or you can search across all of them. But it works the same way. If you're a MyHeritage subscriber, you can go in there and search all of this material. Here's an example where I've searched for the relatively unusual surname Weinglass, and I'm finding a few references to it in the Jewish community in Massachusetts and in New Jersey and some other places, where New Jersey and New York, where my ancestors lived. Newsbank is the company that actually owns Genealogy Bank, and they own a product also called Access World News, which are more current newspapers. They're newspapers that were born digital. You also probably going to find that this is something that your local public library or your local academic library might subscribe to. So this is very useful for finding more recent obituaries, more recent stories. Again, things that probably were published in the 1990s and later. That's typically what you're going to see. Let's quickly look at a few strategies and tips. Make sure that you're aware of any errors in typing because OCR process may misspell names, particularly if they're unusual. You can use the limiting features of geography and dates as needed, and maybe add first names if you're dealing with a common surname like I do with Smith. Be aware of the geography. Your ancestors lived in a place, but they might have been near a town in a different state. So think about all of the newspapers that cover the area where your ancestor lived, even if they were in a different county or a different state. Also be aware that the event that is being covered might have appeared If the event happened in the morning, it might be in an evening newspaper on the same day, but if it happened later in the day, it probably wouldn't appear until the morning edition on the next day. Also, some newspapers are only weekly or twice a week as opposed to daily, so you're going to have to look for the next issue that might have appeared after the event of your ancestor. You can do a lot of sorting around oldest to newest, newest to oldest, and some other ways to help you find the results you want. And in some cases, because there could be coverage much later, you're going to be looking for things that might have happened, say, a week later, a month later, a couple of months later, particularly in cases that might have been lawsuits or things relating to crimes. Those might have been covered a lot later. And finally, you need to learn how to use each of the websites that involve historical newspapers, how to set the limits of geography and dates. Learn how to do that phrase searching so that you can find your ancestor's name, first name, last name together, or in some cases use the searching for nearby words because the first name and the last name might have been separated by a middle initial or by a middle name. Again, learn how to sort your results, how to zoom in and out of the images, how to crop to get just the article you want, how to download the result and save it to your computer because you really want to keep that image and keep it with your other genealogy research, and learn how to share the results. As you discover these newspaper stories, you're going to be pretty excited, so you're going to want to be able to share a newspaper article with another member of the family. They'll be thrilled. So there's a lot to do here, a lot to look for. I hope that you've enjoyed both part 1 and part 2 of front page news, and good luck in looking for your ancestor stories in the newspaper.